Hello, everyone. Thanks for checking out this episode of Really Dicey. This is Manny, and I'm here with.
Violet Gray. I am a nerd comedian and sometimes podcaster. I do a lot of nerd related humor, and also I have contributed monsters for Paizo.
Hi everyone, I am May Beasley. I run the board game Instagram account and TikTok account Ameritrash Talk, where I just do tabletop enthusiast type things. And I also am a cast member on Really Dicey's Dancing Dice Theater.
I'm James Droucker. I'm an RPG writer. I've worked with the Sons of the Singularity on Journal the Machine and their upcoming Between the Devil and the Deep. And I'm also a writer on Mark Brainhagen's Lost Lorn project, which is always in production right now.
Excellent, excellent. So today, viewers, I put this team together to talk about monsters. So I think usually dungeon masters or game masters usually come across a certain point. Even those that love playing board games, I'm including that into discussion as well, where you wanted to do something that may surprise or thrill your players, and sometimes they're trying to think what creative ways they can do so. And I think sometimes that can be kind of a headache at times, because you always want to keep things lively in your gaming sessions. So we're going to talk about that a bit, and let me pass the first question to Violet. Bestiary 3 for Pathfinder. I should have brought the book out. Great book. I really like that book. I'm impressed at not only at how diverse the inspiration from different mythologies are, but it just makes
Absolutely.
Usually by the third book in any bestiary, I sometimes wonder like the excitement of it kind of dies down, like they're running out of ideas, but not so. They're just full of great stuff. But so when you create monsters, especially new monsters, where do you go? What inspires you?
Well, personally, one thing to expound on what you said is that for the longest time, monsters and inspiration tend to come from medieval Europe. And I feel like the reason that you see this and you're like, the excitement hasn't died down is because we're just getting to a point where we're exploring other parts of the world in a fantasy context. A lot of this stuff was always out there. And it's just that I think with conversations that we're having in like a socio-political context, we're starting to explore and we're starting to see a lot of this stuff for the first time. Now, for me, I think about what kind of experience I want my players to have. So, for example, I created the monkeys in Bestiary 3. In my experience, people play tabletop role-playing games to encounter the fantasy creatures, not the mundane creatures. So for this one, I decided that I would like for my players to get something out of it. So I wrote in the write-up of monkeys how monkeys, and this is true in real life, will oft have learned to steal things from humans and then hold them for ransom for food. So one of the ideas I floated, for example, is that what if a monkey stole something and the person was afraid to go near them, and then the adventurer comes along and they're still holding it. And so I decided that I wanted to do more than just have a creature that just might bite you for 1d4 damage and leave.
Same question to James. So Journal the Machine, I thought you were really creative in your adventure scenarios there. I won't spoil it. You gotta check it out yourselves, viewers.
I think for my own process, in terms of the ones that I've created, because especially in terms of Journal of the Machine, it was it's based on a specific time and place, which is French Indochina during when it was colonized and into the Vietnamese War kind of era. So we've got a very specific culture there. And the first place I went with that is, well, what are the mythical cryptids and creatures that exist within the cultures that live there, and started using those as my base. And I came across one that it's a Vietnamese cryptid called the Con Rit, which is, for lack of a better description, it's a giant sea snake centipede creature that's been described. Very, very kind of cool. And I sort of used that as my base, and I built from that to create something that wasn't just a carbon copy of the cryptid, but used that base and so I built off of that, and this sort of kind of became a cross between a giant centipede and a lobster, and but still maintained a really good closeness to the culture that it came from, and then delving further into the culture, finding like ancient gods and demons and beasts and stuff that are part of their own mythology that sort of help work in with that creature. I think when you're building this, to repeat, what Violet said about finding that truth within it, is, I think, helps make the monster not only more real, but in some respects maybe even a little more horrific, especially when I'm writing something that's a horror game. You want the creature to have that fear, and then also trying to create a logic in terms of how it acts in the real world. Yes, a monkey steals items to get the food from whoever it's stolen from. How do I take that kind of a notion with a real creature? Well, how does a lobster live in the real world? And did a lot of reading on the lobster. Found some really horrifying things about lobsters. Like if you want to go see something very terrifying, go look at a picture of what a lobster's mouth looks like. It's nightmare fuel.
It's Lovecraftian.
Oh my God, it's terrifying, and it was perfect. I was like, I have to use this. But not only that, like a lobster sheds its shell on a regular basis. And again, I don't know about these things, so I was learning as I was writing and finding out about these elements, and it built into the story, and it built into how the monster was presented. So using the truth and the reality as part of your fiction is, I think it's almost vital when you're creating these things, because unless you're going like completely gonzo, you want something that's grounded in reality, so that there's less of a hitch when your players encounter it. Because if it's too weird within the context of what your game is, then everybody's going to stop for a second and go, "Wow, that's really weird." Instead of, "Oh my God, there's a monster. What do we do?" You don't want that moment of getting out of the moment, as it were. So that's my thought.
So May, do you see an evolution with how monsters are used in board gaming? Do you see a change, and if you do, how so?
I'll say that I have noticed, at least in the last maybe 3 or 4 years, that as the board game hobby starts to, like, he was Violet, it said, like, branch out of just like Greek mythology, and they start venturing into other parts of the world, that I'm starting to see monsters from other parts of the world. My mom is from the Philippines, so I'm not unfamiliar with some Asian monsters that my husband thinks are terrifying, that were just in children's stories that I read my son. But I've started to see those come out in games. Was that Rising Sun by Eric Lang? I keep thinking of that game that has some kind of, Japanese underlying concepts and things like that. And I just think that as we start venturing into other cultures, we start seeing a little bit of evolution in the monsters that we see in games. Now, I don't play a lot of like horror or scary type board games, creatures that appear normally in RPGs that we play, but I have seen those come up just in general, as like I said, but it's been more recent. I've been gaming, I think 10, 11 years now. And it wasn't until probably the last 3 or 4 years that I've started seeing the monsters be a little bit different than they were in the past. Most of them were just kind of the same old, same old. We've been tabled in the tabletop hobby for about 10 or 11 years now. And it really feels like just recently that this is happening. Like it's all of a sudden publishers are like, oh yeah, there's other stuff that we could be doing. Why aren't we tapping into that? Why aren't we exploring that? And so I think it's good though, because it's not the same old stuff all the time. I love D&D and I love beholders, but if I saw another beholder in a game, like
Yeah.
I don't know how scary it is anymore to see one, other than the fact I know what it is.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a function of we've been gaming fantasy worlds for what 30, 40, 50 years, and it is getting kind of samey. And you know, your standard Western fantasy tropes include dragons, beholders, orcs, and goblins and stuff like that, and it hasn't really deviated from that. And now these days we're definitely embracing a lot more of an inclusive culture in our games as well. I think it's just sort of a natural evolution that we start looking outside of just Western fantasy tropes to find those really cool and interesting monsters.
Do you think that is, anyone can answer this, do you think that is because monsters, things that were considered monsters like orcs, goblins, have become so I guess mainstream would be the right word. This is they're everywhere. They're no longer seen as horrifying.
As to what you were saying, the thing about the recent shift that I'm starting to see, especially with systems like Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder, is that it used to be you had this, if it's an orc, if it's a goblin, they are universally bad. Orc means bad. Orc means vicious raider. And now we're starting to move away from that into more of the perspective that a creature that's smart enough to be intelligent is probably going to have a very nuanced personality. So if it's a sentient creature, some of them might be good, some of them might be bad, just like humans are. And so I think as the humanoid races become more humanized in our current perspective, I do think that we're starting to look elsewhere. I'm currently developing a fantasy game set in an Africa-inspired setting, and because of that, I started to research some African mythological creatures, and I was not prepared. There are some really interesting creatures from these cultures. So, for example, there's a creature called an impindulu, which is basically like a phoenix, but instead of its element being fire, its element is lightning and electricity. And I thought, that's really cool. How come I never saw anything like that before? But yeah, I think that as what we're used to is changing, we'll still need something to scratch that combat itch, to scratch that element of danger. And I think, these days you encounter an orc, you might talk to them and like, I wonder if they're a raider or a peddler, and we're still going to need those things that we can just pull our weapons out and deal with.
Yeah, I get exceedingly frustrated when people seem to think that removing that notion of orcs and goblins and everything being inherently evil is limiting in a game, because I don't think it is at all. It's even in terms of creating monsters, because when everything can be a monster, it just makes your story so much more interesting to me. So I can't wrap my head around it sometimes that people have gotten so up in arms about some of this.
Yeah, I don't understand it, because humans can be a-holes.
Oh God, the worst
Like-
monsters in the world.
Yeah. We do not actually need a universally bad race or anything like that. Humans can scratch that itch just fine on their own.
I think as a player that it's actually more exciting for me to not know. Like when I
Mhm.
encounter something,
Yeah.
there's an extra, especially because it's a role-playing game, like there's that extra level of, is this somebody I can trust? Is this something I need to be like aware of? When I don't know, there's all these like skills I don't always get to use to try to figure out, is this something I can trust? Is this something I should be wary of? And it makes the game more open to me personally. I guess I can't speak to other players and their experience, but I like it. If I'm like, oh, is this a good orc or a bad orc? Is this a good human or a bad human? Like it could be anything. So I think it's great.
Sometimes the unknown is probably the most scariest thing
Yeah.
that could be.
Absolutely.
So I had something that happened to me about 7 years ago at PAX East that was interesting. We were playtesting the first expansion for, okay, let me see if I can say that name of the board game right. Betrayal on the House on Haunted Hill. I think and we were trying it, and there were a bunch of different media people, and we were just playtesting. I think it's called Widow's Hill, something like that. And we were playing it, and in the game, you find out eventually that one of you is a monster. And one media person found out that they were a werewolf. And once that happened, he freaked out. He didn't want to play anymore. Didn't want anything to do with the game. Didn't want to do anything with us. He just left. He was like afraid of being a werewolf, and it surprised me just because I don't find werewolves scary, at least not anymore. Not since the 80s, I think. But it occurred to me that for some people, horror can mean different things. It could be defined differently. So when it comes to, let's say, if I would ask you, hey, let's play a horror themed game. Is there, what do you look for? Is there a way to measure if something might be too scary? Is that possible?
I don't know that there's a good way to measure it because different things are scary to different people. And in board games, for me, it's the tension that is sometimes feels scary, not necessarily the monster itself. I'm going to give an example. Recently, Van Ryder Games, which is like local here in Nashville, they put out this big solo game called Final Girl. And in the whole game, you are the final girl and you're like going after these monsters. And each box, it's like a core box, and then each box is a feature film, includes a monster and a location, and they all play differently. So like the one I have is this carnival one. I don't know why I picked this because I'm afraid of clowns. And it's like a puppet master, and he like keeps releasing these puppets. And then one of the finale cards, he turns all the victims into puppets and they're all chasing you. I was like, this is so terrible. Like, I'm so scared. And it's just a game, like it's just dice rolling. But I played the same one where that didn't happen and it didn't feel as scary because I was winning and there was like less tension. It felt like I was overpowering him because of what was happening. So I think that the tension is really kind of what's scary when you're doing a horror board game. But I'm also, like I said, I'm not particularly afraid of many. Like, I think in my mind, it's all like super fake. Even scary movies, it has to be something like when you were saying monkeys, I was like, that's way scarier than a beholder because a monkey is a real thing that could attack me in real life. Like, so to me, like movies or games where it's something like in the new set, they have one that's called The Intruders. And that's like strangers that would get into your house. That is terrifying to me. I think that is way more scary than a monster that in my head is fictitious. So, but I don't know what, the guy got up. Normally people want to be the one who gets to be the traitor in those games. The werewolf, he may have had a traumatic experience with like a dog or a wolf or something and it, triggered. I mean, who knows? But I don't know that there is a way to measure if it's too scary for some, because everybody's going to be a little bit different, like their tolerance for what's happening.
I think if you're leaning into tropes with horror, it's a little easier because everybody knows about horror films and different types of horror films. If you're not straying too far from what people already deem acceptable, you've got a decent enough starting place. It's when you start moving away from those things, and usually it's with more mature and suggestive content that's when people really start to say, I don't know if I'm comfortable with this.
Mhm.
And even getting into more esoteric horror as opposed to, monster jumps out and tears somebody's head off. I mean, granted, somebody can have issues with that, and rightly so. That's what they have. But uh, but when you're getting into those more challenging types of horror, I would hope that that a GM knows his table or has forethought to communicate with his players to say, these are some of the ideas that I'm playing with. Is everybody going to be okay with that?
Absolutely.
When you're creating a monster, let's say a new one for your players for the first time, um, for anyone that's watching this and like want to create a monster, they're playing something, is there any like advice you would give about like these are the things you should watch out for, so maybe you don't go too far? I think making something scary is sort of easy, but containing that might be more difficult.
Mhm. Well, I think it's important to establish what your players are comfortable with. Uh, my players know that when I'm GMing, uh, we're going to get into some body horror stuff. Like if there's some gore, they're like, and there it is.
Yeah.
And but other than that, I think it's a point between knowing any issues that your players might have and creating a truly terrifying monster. Like I've never run a campaign where I didn't create my own monster in it. And where I start with that is I ask myself, what's terrifying to me? And that's how I start the creative monster. And then I think about, okay, um, I am a I'm a horror fan in a way that your average person is not. And so I have to understand that other people might be more well adjusted than me. but but yeah, I guess communication is the key, is what I'm trying to say there.
I think it's important to embrace mundanity in horror, and I think a lot of people don't really understand what that means. But I think it's really easy to have a big monster seem scary, but it's about putting it in a situation that doesn't normally feel scary is what really makes it scary, or bring it out in a moment that people aren't expecting. In terms of structure in a game, one of the first games I ever ran as a GM, actually the first game I ever ran as a GM, was called Cthulhu for D20. I'm sorry. A lot of people bristle at that, but it was a good book regardless. And I had some ambitious structural ways of doing things. I had I think it was a dimensional shambler, because Call of Cthulhu, and I managed to get my PCs to split up, which normally PCs do not want to do. So good on me. They actually split up into 3 groups. But that's another story entirely. And the encounter with this dimensional shambler started in one place with one of the groups, and then they sort of beat it back a bit and it ran away. And then I cut to the other group and it comes bursting out of the foliage towards the other players. And it's just a great moment, and it's all of a sudden a horror. And because Cthulhu, especially Call of Cthulhu, has a built-in mechanic that uses sanity, horror comes from a completely different place in as much as you're not trying to scare your players as much as you're trying to scare their characters so that they'll role play that element. And if you've got decent enough role playing players, they'll fall right into that, and everybody's going to have the right kind of fun in that they're watching or playing the movie that they're watching. So the suspension of disbelief still exists, but they can still be completely horrified because that's how their character would react. So
Interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, if I think of like Bela Lugosi's Dracula, like we probably would all laugh before we all die, but I think if we were playing characters from 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, that would be very horrifying to them. Before we wrap up, I want to ask everyone one question. What is your favorite monster?
I think I'm just going to have to go with Cthulhu just because I'm a Cthulhu guy. And like is my favorite, and he's the big bad. So, yeah, go with Cthulhu.
Do owl bears count as monsters? Because
yes.
they're my favorite.
Yeah.
They're just my favorite. In my mind, they're like, I know they're supposed to be scary, but they're like lovable. What's that? I don't know if y'all have ever played the Lords of Waterdeep game, and there's one that's like the card is called Domesticate Owl Bears. It's one of the quest
I've seen that. Yeah.
I don't even care if I win the game. If I get that one card, it's like I'm a winner in my mind. like I domesticated the owl bears. We're dead. They're my favorite. I think that they're scary and cute, so that makes them extra terrifying because you would, want to pet one, but it would bite you.
So I have sort of a two-part answer. In general, my favorite monster is vampires, because I believe that to have a scary vampire, you have to have a person who was scary if they weren't a vampire. So someone like Ramsay Bolton from Game of Thrones would make a terrifying vampire. But from the perspective of a forever GM, I gotta say my favorite monster is the Mimic that I love, and I never make a treasure chest. Never, ever, ever.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it, embracing the mundanity.
It's got to be like a toilet.
I think both combatants lose in that situation.
Yeah, there's no winner.
I do like one time I got my party to attack a treasure chest, and then when they got up on it, they found that the table it was on was the Mimic. And
nice.
Clever.
I like it.
Well, since we're sharing, for myself, I think growing up, Freddy Krueger was my favorite monster. Growing up, nowadays though, the Death in Final Destination.
Yes,
I can't watch those movies. I
tried as a concept. Yeah,
it's something about that inevitability.
Yeah, like you can't escape it. Something somehow is going to get you in some way, and that just freaks me out too much. But yes, everyone, thank you so much for taking the time. Let's all go ahead and reintroduce ourselves and plug anything you wish to plug.
Well, I was James Droucker, and I've nothing plugged yet. I'm going to be working on a scenario for the new version of X-Crawl that will be coming out from Goodman Games at some point, making a third-party scenario for them with my business partner Hamad on the jar from Bahrain. So that I'm hoping to start pretty soon. So.
Let's see. I have been Violet Gray. Why was I going to say Violent J? That is a completely different person. Violet Gray, and you can check me out on Twitter as Violet Silver, or you can look up my geek stand-up on YouTube, Violet Gray, Gray. Oh, Chaotic Violet on Instagram, and you can see all my weird costumes.
Oh, that made me excited. Costumes. I am May Beasley, and you can find me on Instagram at Amira Trash Talk, and then I just lost it. On the TikTok at Amira Trash Talk _May.
And this is Manny from Really Dicey. Everyone, thank you for being a part of this, and everyone watching this, thank you for watching. If you hear something under your bed, don't look. Have a great day, everyone.